Hi everybody. I'm here today to talk about the 6 books that I DNF'd in 2020. I actually read over 60 books this year, so I think 10%, that's not too bad, but I am very determined to discover why these books didn't work out for me, and so hopefully this coming year I am not going to DNF any books. Because I think for the most part I went into books that were maybe recommendations or I heard other people talking about them and then chose to read them, and those were mainly the ones that I ended up not finishing. The first book that I did not finish is The 100,000 Kingdoms. This was a recommendation. I was talking to a friend about how I was getting more into fantasy books, and they told me that this was a really good one. Now, I don't want to write off this author because I know she's really popular and she's written a lot of things that people love, so I will definitely try other books by her, but this one just didn't work for me. I think I got about halfway through it before I gave up, and I don't remember too terribly much, but our main character was disowned by the family. And I think it was her grandfather that was actually the king in the kingdom. And so the premise was that she and I think a couple of her cousins were being called back to, the main part of the kingdom, and were going to have to compete with one another to earn the throne. Not a bad premise. I think it sounds really cool. But at least for the part that I read of the book, about halfway, I didn't see any of that happening. We only very briefly, if at all, saw the cousins, so there was no real competition. And I remember the gods were a big part of this world, but I was kind of confused. I didn't feel like it was explained really well, that the gods weren't elsewhere. The gods kind of lived and interacted with them. Wasn't explained super well for me, so I felt like if I'm halfway through the book and I'm still confused about this gods versus people dynamic, is it really ever going to be explained to me very well? And I think the nail in the coffin for me was she was doing some exploring in the castle and stumbled upon some secret mural that was hidden behind a bookshelf. I don't know, something about that scene, it was just so conveniently and simply laid out, and it didn't feel like a big revelation. It just turned me off the book. I remember when I read Priory of the Orange Tree, there were some similar scenes of like the history being unraveled, and I thought it was done really well. And I was always really excited to find out new clues about the story in that book. In this one, I was just kind of rolling my eyes at the execution. My next DNF was The Starlight C, and I think this is one of those books that a lot of people either love or they DNF. I was really determined to read this. I finished probably 3/4 of this book before giving up, because I kind of realized that this story was not going to go anywhere and was never going to satisfy me. I was essentially reading it still because a lot of things intrigued me about what happened. So this is by the same author of The Night Circus, and from what I've heard, that book is pretty similar in its layout. I've never read it, but when I heard the premise for the Starlight C, which is all about mystery and libraries and a story, I don't know, it was really intriguing. So if it's more important to you to have things like artful descriptions and atmosphere than to have any kind of story, this would be for you. I don't think her writing is bad or anything. It's just the type of story that this is was really not for me, and it was a lot of aimless wandering. My third book was Slaughterhouse V, and I actually like Kurt Vonnegut a lot, and I've read several of his other books, but this one did not hit the mark for me. You're following a war veteran who is having flashbacks to his time when he was in war. And it kind of has Kurt Vonnegut's kind of sarcastic humor, but it was a little bit silly for me in this one. The style of writing was really not working for me. And added to the fact that I really don't like to read war stories or anything like that, and I didn't know that's what it was going into it, which is weird because this is a really famous book, but I knew the name, just didn't know what it was about. So I think I finished this one after about 80 pages. I still like Kurt Vonnegut, just not this book. The next book is another fantasy book that was recommended to me, and that was The Eye of the World. I've talked about this one in a previous video. I was super excited to read that book because it's a huge, long series, and if you like the characters and you like the story, then having 15 or so books in the same world is amazing because it's never going to end. You just get more story. But unfortunately, I ended up not liking the writing style and not liking the characters. I just found the writing was simple, and from what I read, which I think was about 150 pages, the layout of the book was so similar to the beginning of The Lord of the Rings. So I wasn't confident that the story was going to be very unique. And the characters were kind of annoying, and I didn't really like them. They were very stereotypical. And those two things right off the bat, I'm like, I don't want to get invested in a 15-book series when I'm already knowing from 150 pages in, I'm not liking this so far. So I'm not going to read thousands and thousands of pages of something I don't like. So I decided to just cut it off there. My next DNF was not a recommendation. It was something I picked on my own. Again, I'm not going to write off this author, but this book was definitely not in a style that I liked, and that is Something Wicked This Way Comes. I wanted to read this for a spooky book to read in October, and I started it and got probably about 100 pages in. So in the story, you're following two young teenage boys. They might be in middle school, and they become enthralled with this mysterious carnival that comes to their town. And I really only read maybe one scene where they actually went there. Essentially, there's a wicked carnival and creepy things happen. I don't know where the story goes past that point, which is, again, surprising because this is a pretty famous book. But the writing in this was so obnoxious. It was the very definition of purple prose. So everything was told so artfully and so metaphorically that it was very hard to even follow the story and what was happening. So I just found myself being very confused as to whether characters were really doing actions or imagining them, and if they really saw things or if they were daydreaming. It was very hard to tell, which I guarantee is probably done on purpose, seeing how I've read other books by Ray Bradbury and they were nothing like this. But it was definitely not something that I could see myself putting up with for a whole book, so I gave that one up. And my last book that I did not finish this month was Dear Edward. This was one that was in a book club, and I really didn't get far in this one at all, probably 50 or 60 pages. You're following Edward, who was a kid on a plane with his family, and the plane crashed, and he was the only survivor, but he was extremely young when it happened. And then I think throughout the book, you kind of follow him as he grows up and gets older, and the ways that that event affect his life is what I think happens. I didn't get very far. I could tell right away that this was going to be kind of like a Hallmark movie style book, and I really just, I don't know. I don't enjoy reading them. They're just take it or leave it. I don't hate them, but it's kind of like I don't feel like I need to waste my time reading those type of books. And yeah, that was my last DNF. So my conclusions, based on the books that I had here, is, first of all, I decided to take myself out of my book club. It's really fun to talk about books with people on a regular basis, and you've all read the same things, but only a couple of the books were winners for me this year throughout the year that I've been in my book club, and then some I didn't even bother finishing. So ultimately, I'd rather spend my time reading stuff that I chose and I really want to do, instead of just reading a book for a book club that I never would have picked on my own. So that's one thing I'm not going to do this year. Another thing is I'm going to be very wary of recommendations. I think people mean really well when they recommend books, but it's really personal what things you're going to like, and writing style and stuff can really turn me off quickly if it's not my cup of tea. The last thing I really need to be careful about is fantasy books. I love fantasy books, but I feel like I never read ones that are really, really amazing. They're hard to find. So I think I'm going to kind of do my own research before I try to start anything, because 3.5 of my DNFs were fantasy. I know there has to be good ones out there somewhere. I just haven't found them yet. Alright, that's all of my DNFs for this year. I hope I don't have so many next year. I will see you all next time.